Welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 247. This time I'm going to talk about the debut record from that fantastic little band from Athens, Georgia, the B-52s, released in 1979 on Island in the UK and Warner Brothers in North America. This is the first Canadian pressing of this record from 1979, which sounds pretty darn good. What to expect from this? Well, people had been trying to take irony to the top of the charts since the Velvet Underground, but this is the first album, I think you can say, which unambiguously succeeds at that. It's a record which was very unsettling for people at the time. I remember this quite distinctly. Like punk, it has nothing to do with mainstream rock as it was in the late 1970s. Unlike punk, it's bright and funny and colorful and dance positive at a time when dance music, in particular disco, was under racist and misogynistic attack. Remember the whole disco sucks movement. It was also occasionally written off as a novelty act, and those kinds of things did exist, if you remember the Disco Duck or the Flying Lizards around this time. But this was a band which could really rock. They had great instrumentalists, they had great songwriting, they had three incredible vocalists. Maybe one of the reasons why this record was so unsettling is that it was consciously or perhaps unconsciously a very gay record. It's full of campy vocals and campy fashion statements. This is perhaps unsurprising because, as we now know, 80% of the band were queer. What I do remember from growing up in small-town British Columbia was that this group was loved by the punks, and it was loved by kids who loved to dance, and it was hated by the rock dudes who thought that the B-52s were for fags. But those guys also thought punk was for fags too, and those guys are still in small-town BC protesting vaccines. The story of the B-52s starts with the Wilson family, Ricky Wilson and his kid sister Cindy. Ricky was born in March 1953 in Athens, and his sister Cindy was born a little under 4 years later in February 1957. Both kids were musical. Growing up, Ricky learned to play guitar from the TV because PBS in particular had a show called Learning to Play Folk Guitar with Laura Weber on in the mid-late 1960s, and this was basically his training ground. As a teenager, Ricky worked at the dump, and he made himself enough money to buy himself a guitar, and he learned to play along with the TV, and he taught his kid sister Cindy to harmonize along with him so they would jam together as kids. By the time he was 16 in 1969, Athens, Georgia had progressed to be the kind of place that actually had head shops, as they used to be called, and it was at a head shop where Ricky meets a guy called Keith Strickland, and both of them, it turns out, had a real interest not just in smoking weed, but also in Eastern mysticism and lots of eclectic kinds of musical influences, and they became quite close friends. Ricky also comes out to Keith around this time. Keith's also gay, but he's not quite there yet. That summer they began to collaborate in writing songs. They gave their band a name. It never really performed, but it was called Loon, and they used to practice in the garage. Later that year, Ricky and Keith hooked up with another couple of budding musicians from their high school and began to tour around the Athens area as a band called Black Narcissus. After high school in 1972, Ricky heads off to the University of Georgia. Keith doesn't, but they stay in contact, and in 1976, the two of them tour Europe before returning to Athens. When they got back to Athens, Keith's dad gave them both a job at the bus station, which he managed, and Ricky and his kid sister Cindy then move into a house together. Outside Georgia, the other point of origin for the band is in New Jersey. Kate Pierson, who was the oldest member of the band, was born in Weehawken, New Jersey in 1948. She ends up getting a journalism degree from Boston College in the early 1970s. She moved to the UK for a bit, and then she and her then husband moved to Athens, Georgia, basically wanting to not go back to the big sprawl of the whole Philly to New York corridor, but kind of go back to the land, because Athens was pretty rural in those days. And for $15 a month, they managed to rent themselves a little shack in a piece of agricultural land. This, of course, is the famous putative Love Shack. Lead singer Fred Schneider was born in Newark in 1951. He ends up going to the University of Georgia as well, same time as Ricky, but they didn't really intersect and didn't do a ton musically growing up. By the mid-1970s, he's living in Athens still. He's a janitor and he's working as a Meals on Wheels driver. So around this time, in 1976, the Wilson siblings and Keith Strickland made friends with Kate Pierson, who had just moved there, living in her love shack, and also with Fred Schneider. All of them were huge music fans. Fred had a huge music collection, and they bonded over this. And one night, they're all out at a Chinese restaurant, and they're just goofing around. The idea comes to make a band. Well, initially, of course, Ricky and Keith were the only two that had ever been in a band of any sort. So the band starts jamming as people who have never sung or played instruments are learning how to sing and play instruments. And Keith and Ricky are writing music as they all jam together. They quickly wrote Rock Lobster, which was based on a riff which Ricky had previously written, and it was based on a disco in Atlanta, which had a kind of a sea life theme. And their first gig ever was Valentine's Day, 1977, just a few months after they decided to form a band. Because they had kind of a retro kitsch vibe going on, the name B-52s came from the beehive hairdos that the girls were wearing. One of those actually apparently bears resemblance to the nose cone of a B-52 bomber. Rock Lobster and the rest of their act becomes hugely popular in the local club circuit, and they're signed initially by a guy called Danny Beard, who owned a record store in Atlanta and created his own label, DB Records, for the explicit purpose of recording and releasing Rock Lobster. This is an earlier version of the song, not the version most of us have since heard, and when it is released, it becomes a huge underground hit. They get channeled into all of the cutting-edge venues. They played Max's Kansas City, they played CBGB's in New York, and by June 1978, again, just a year after their first gig, they've actually got a write-up in the New York Times based on their CBGB's gig. After they played New York, the hype around the band was really too much to sustain for a label which was basically a guy running an Atlanta record shop. And so Chris Blackwell of Island Records signs them to a deal where Island is their distributor in the UK and Warner's is their distributor in the US. This record is made at Compass Point Studios in Nassau in the Bahamas in the spring of 1979 with Chris Blackwell producing. Kate Pierson is on vocals, organ, guitar, and bass. Cindy Wilson is on vocals, guitar, bongos, and tambourine. Fred Schneider is on vocals, bass, and toy piano. Ricky Wilson plays guitar, and Keith Strickland is on drums and percussion. And recall, of course, that none of these guys, except for Ricky and Keith, knew how to play any instruments at all just 2 years prior. The sound of the record is extremely stripped down. Blackwell wanted to capture the sound they had in the clubs, and this, of course, was a time, new wave time, when overproduced music was basically anathema, certainly for the market that the B-52s were going to hit. As I mentioned, they'd recorded Rock Lobster and also 52 Girls earlier in 1978. They re-recorded the versions of that. They did 6 other originals, plus they did a cover of Petula Clark's hit from 1964 or so, Downtown. It's released on July 6, 1979. It's a massive hit. Rock Lobster gets to number 17 on the Billboard Hot 100. And John Lennon famously said that this record is the one that made him realize, largely because Kate and Cindy were channeling Yoko Ono in their lyrics, that the world had caught up to Yoko Ono and it was now time for him to get back into the studio. Side one starts with Planet Claire with that great synthy open, the completely ripped off guitar line from Peter Gunn, and Kate's amazing bongo playing. And then you get that main organ line. It's 1962 and 2062 at the same time. Fred bringing camp right into the mainstream. It's incredibly hook-laden as a song. It's fantastic. That's followed by 52 Girls, which is just an epic surf rocker. Cindy and Kate laid down an incredible vocal, channeling these girl groups from long, long ago, and I think this is one of the best dance tracks in rock history. That's then followed by that brooding masterpiece, Dance This Mess Around. Kate with a vocal which starts off conventionally enough, but then becomes fabulously weird, with the cultural salience of Limburger cheese, I think, being something that really owes itself to Mad Magazine. Anyway, amazing track. Then finally, on this amazing vinyl side, we have Rock Lobster, which, despite all of its subsequent notoriety and campy bits, is just an amazing rock song which builds and releases tension on numerous occasions. It was inspired by Yoko Ono, but of course it ends up inspiring John. Side 2 is not as strong in this record as Side 1. In fact, the band had consciously held back some of their club hits from this record so they had material for their second album, Wild Planet. Lava is a solid rocker, but it kind of lacks the melodies of the first side, and the vocals a little bit buried. There's a Moon in the Sky called The Moon is a lot better. This is an ode to the space age. Vocals are much better isolated, and the riffing has real punch. Hero Worship has an intro which kind of anticipates REM, ironically enough. It gives way to a very Stones-like groove and a great vocal. 6060842 is a great tune about a number on a bathroom wall. Great backing vocals by Cindy and Kate, and a superb guitar contribution again by Ricky Wilson. Then finally we have Downtown, which is a cover, as I mentioned, of the Petula Clark song, imagined and deconstructed by Kate and Cindy, but really nothing to write home about. This is a record with one all-time great rock and roll side and another side with real highs and lows. But it still knocked the whole rock and roll world on its ear, and it's still being played all over the world today. For me, it's a real landmark, and I'd give it 4.5 out of 5 stars.